Thank you all for coming. What I thought I'd do today is talk about how the category of interest as the fundamental liberal political category was thought about and debated and contested in colonial India, in late colonial India. And I'll be looking in particular at the way in which groups such as Hindus and Muslims, in particular Hindus and Muslims, are conceived of as interest groups. Are they interest groups? If not, what are they? Can they become interest groups if they are not ones already? How might we be able to think about the interaction of these really large, amorphous, and internally diverse and fractured communities, as they are normally called, as political categories? And so what I'll be doing is talking about how a number of the most important political figures of the day engaged in this debate, which is not simply about Hindus and Muslims, but about the work of the category of interest itself as what I'm calling the fundamental liberal political category. Right? And the figures I'm dealing with who are part of this conversation include Bhimrao Ambedkar, a very celebrated Dalit, or as he was then called, untouchable politician, Gandhi, otherwise known as the Mahatma, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the president of the Muslim League, who goes on to found Pakistan, Veer Savarkar, or Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, I should say more properly, the Hindu nationalist leader, eventually head of the Hindu Mahasabha, Muhammad Iqbal, the important Muslim philosopher, Indian Muslim philosopher and poet, and who else? I think that's it. And I would like to see these people as engaged in this debate. Of course, they're only the most important names, almost recognizable names, who are part of a debate that went much beyond them. So let me begin here with a selection from a letter by Dr. Ambedkar written on the 14th of May 1946 to A.V. Alexander, who was one of the members of the cabinet mission. The cabinet mission, as you may know, was a mission sent by the British government to India on the very eve of independence, a year before it, to arrive at some kind of constitutional agreement, in particular between the Muslim League and the Indian National Congress. Right? And they met all kinds of people, all the important leaders, and here is Ambedkar writing to one of the members of the cabinet mission. He says, "To my mind, it is only right to say that the Hindus and the Muslims are today mentally incompetent to decide upon the destiny of this country. Both Hindus and Muslims are just crowds. It must be within your experience that a crowd is less moved by material profit than by a passion collectively shared. It is easier to persuade a mass of men to sacrifice itself collectively than to act upon a cool assessment of advantages. A crowd easily loses all sense of profit and loss. It is moved by motives which may be high or low, genial or barbarous, compassionate or cruel, but is always above or below reason. The common sense of each is lost in the emotion of all. It is easier to persuade a crowd to commit suicide than to accept a legacy." Now, you might think that this is simply a bad-tempered riff on an inherited trope, which is that of how people who gather on the streets in large numbers are crowds that then lose all sense of their distinct individuality and become these sort of mindless forms. But he's not, in fact, speaking about crowds, actual crowds on the street. He's speaking about Hindus and Muslims as themselves categories that are just crowds, right? That these are groups that don't actually hold together politically. They cannot be described as interests. So what he's saying, if you recall some of the words, Hindus and Muslims are groups whose mobilization, political mobilization, is not actuated by material profit, by advantages, by profit and loss, and they cannot actually accept a legacy. All of these words are about interest, obviously, and interest conceived of as property, right? And indeed, interest is often thought about in this manner, that your interest is defined by something that you wish to protect or further, property, either very materially speaking or indeed metaphorically or abstractly. That what you're protecting, Islam conceived of as your property, which you need to advance. Right? And Ambedkar seems to be suggesting, the politics, if you can call them that, of these groups is actually not motivated by interest. Right? It seems to have no link to material profit, advantages, profit and loss, or a legacy, to use those words. Right? And that therefore India's political units, religious ones in particular, are not founded on property and therefore on interest. Now this might of course be because he thinks, and he's not alone in thinking this, that Indian society and Indian social relations cannot be founded on interest because property has not yet come to characterize these social relations. India is not a bourgeois society. Right? Its social relations are not defined by contractual relations, which are automatically about property. Right? Therefore, you cannot have interests in India. And therefore, Hindus and Muslims, in the way they behave, do not represent interests, cannot represent interests. In fact, what he is saying is that, in his last phrase, it is easier to persuade a crowd to commit suicide than to accept a legacy. So he recognizes that one of the things that characterizes the politics of these groups is sacrifice. There's a kind of sacrificial character to their mobilization. Now, even today, you can see in Indian politics how the category of interest on the one hand is omnipresent. Right? Everything can be described as interest politics. Caste groups, religious groups, regional groups, language groups, ethnic groups, gender-based mobilizations, everything is seen as being part of interest politics. And this is the way in which, during every election, Indian television stations play this story. But at the same time, you have the opposing view, which is that these are all irrational categories, and they are not, in fact, behaving according to what should be their interests. In particular because they tend to be often very sacrificial in nature. They're willing to die, they're willing to sacrifice what appears to be their objective interests. But this is not necessarily seen as a question of false consciousness, as in a certain kind of Marxist narrative. And that's what's interesting about it. Right? And so already in the 40s, you have someone like Ambedkar posing this problem. Are Hindus and Muslims interests at all? How can interests exist in India if Indian social relations are not defined by property? If a bourgeois society does not exist in India, there can be no interests. And he seems to suggest that precisely because of this, and I quote again, one of these crowds, is moved by motives which may be high or low, genial or barbarous, compassionate or cruel, but is always above or below reason. And it seems to me that the reference here is to Gandhian politics. That the very things that make for Gandhian nonviolence this sort of transcendent form, where you're willing to sacrifice yourself and you're dedicated to nonviolence, the very beauty, if you will, or the appeal of that form of mobilization is linked inextricably to its opposite, to violence. And that's why Gandhi's followers can do both things at the same time. They're not hypocritical. Right? It's precisely because they seem to lack interest that they can flip back and forth between, on the one hand, these beautiful transcendental ideals of nonviolence, and on the other hand, into great and brutal violence. I think that is an indirect reference to Gandhi. So now I want to look at how, Ambedkar sets this out, I think, very well. And I want to look at how these other important figures debate this point. They all, I think, accept it. Right? For them, the problem of interest is a real problem. Right? And they're divided in the following way. So some figures, like Jinnah or Savarkar, would like to create interests where they did not exist. And others, like Gandhi and Iqbal, think that the fact that interests don't exist in Indian society is a good thing, and it should be pushed even further. So here is Jinnah. Here's a quotation from Jinnah, from his famous presidential address to the Lahore session of the All India Muslim League in 1940, popularly known as the Pakistan Resolution. Right? And he's describing here what is taken to be the two-nation theory, that there are two nations in India, Hindus and Muslims. And he says, the Hindus and Muslims belong to two different religious philosophies, social customs, literatures. They neither intermarry nor interdine together, and indeed, they belong to two different civilizations which are based mainly on conflicting ideas and conceptions. The aspects on life and of life are different. It is quite clear that Hindus and Muslims derive their inspiration from different sources of history. They have different epics, different heroes, and different episodes. Very often, the hero of one is the foe of the other, and likewise, their victories and defeats overlap. Now, on the one hand, of course, this seems to be, it's a deceptive, like Ambedkar's quote, it's deceptive. Here, Jinnah seems to be talking about how Hindus and Muslims are so utterly different that they cannot be put together at all. But if you look at it more closely, what he's saying is actually the opposite is true. They are too intimate. Their victories and defeats overlap. The hero of one is the villain of the other. The problem is that they're too closely bound together. That is the problem. If they weren't, they could really become proper interest groups. All right? They would represent entirely different, as it were, forms of property. And his problem then is, how do you actually make that happen? All right? He thinks, for instance, that the political divisions between Hindus and Muslims, which of course take an institutional form with the very gradual introduction of representative government in India, where you have something called separate electorates introduced, where Hindus vote for Hindu candidates and Muslims vote for Muslim candidates, all right? And then they somehow to get together. So that, of course, is the making of interest in some fashion, but as a privilege. It's not based on anything that actually exists as a society. Jinnah's view is that the problem with India is that even though people describe Hindus and Muslims as being a majority and a minority, respectively, there are no such thing. All right. The Hindus are too internally fragmented to be a majority, and caste is the reason he adduces for that. Whereas the Muslims have a majority themselves in two large sections of the country. And so these European categories are unable to describe what is happening in India. Plus, they are interconnected in all kinds of ways. So he tries through his career to come to some kind of resolution. 1916, there's something called the Lucknow Pact, there's some kind of sharing. And he thinks a solution to what was called the communal problem is only possible if you have actual negotiations and a recognition of each other. Right? Eventually, he says there must be parity, that even though Hindus and Muslims are groups of different sizes, vastly different sizes taken in the country as a whole, because there is no nation that binds them together, they must each treat one another as equals and come to some kind of agreement, and he calls this a social contract. He's very keen on a social, and of course, the reference to a social contract is also, you will understand, a reference to interest and all of these things, right? Because a contract is about property in some ways. Eventually, he comes to the conclusion that the partition of India is the only thing likely to produce interests out of these groups which are not yet political interests. How? Once you partition India, you will actually make Hindus into a real majority in India, and Muslims will be reduced to a minority. They will not be this impossible community they have been in the past, which has majorities in some bits and minorities in others. All right? In Pakistan, the reverse is likely to happen, though in a curious way, the Pakistan that he envisioned would have been a kind of miniaturized form of colonial India, because Hindus and Sikhs would have been made such a large minority as to make neither minority nor majority possible in that country. And this was the case in the early days of it, right? That you couldn't then, you'd have to come to some other kind of agreement. And there's a very famous speech given in 1947 where he says, Hindus will cease to be Hindus and Muslims will cease to be Muslims, and they will all be citizens of Pakistan. And people have either referred to the speech and say, you see, Jinnah was a secular liberal after all, or seen it as being disingenuous in some way. And I think what he was referring to in that speech was this, once we have partitioned the subcontinent, these communities will no longer have a political hold upon us, right? In Pakistan, they will either be an absolute Muslim majority, and in India, or they won't be any majority or minority. And in India, there will be an absolute Hindu majority. And what that meant was that these groups would then cease to be political groups. It's only because you couldn't have these majorities and minorities in colonial India that they occupied the political arena falsely, right? So his point is, and this was his argument throughout his career, that the problem with India is that you're a permanent majority and a permanent minority, right? And therefore you cannot have democracy, because democracy depends upon changing, variable, and shifting political majorities and minorities so that each group can one day have the chance to constitute a government. And those majorities and minorities will be based on economic and other grounds. So there will be interests, properly speaking. Right? It's precisely because Hindus and Muslims, are these outsized, amorphous, interconnected entities that they have falsely taken on a political identification. The partition of India is meant to resolve that. It's meant to undo the intimacy that makes for violence between these two, right? So he has a famous analogy where he says, look, the thing about India is that I've done this, I'm a lawyer, I've done this many times in the past. When you have two brothers, this is like a Hindi film, you have two quarreling brothers, Hindus and Muslims, already note this is a language of intimacy. They're brothers, right? You have two quarreling brothers, and they cannot come to any kind of agreement. What do? You partition their house, which is another commonplace thing in Indian law, right? So you partition the house, and then they can become friends. So the point, how do you solve the Hindu-Muslim problem? By shifting from brotherhood to friendship. What you want to do is to switch from the intimacy, the violent intimacies that link Hindus and Muslims together, to an interest politics in which they can be friends, but a friendship mediated, if you will, through contract. Right? And this is this appears to be the aim of his political thought. You have to destroy the political existence of Hindus and Muslims in order to allow interest, economic and other forms of interest to come to the fore. Right? So in that sense, he is an old-fashioned liberal. His great rival, but sometime ally as well, Savarkar, the Hindu nationalist leader, seems to have a similar view. Right? So here he is in his 1926 book, Hindutva, or Principles of Hindutva, and he's describing the relations of Hindus and Muslims. And what worries him is that there is a claim by scholars and others that even the name Hindu is not owned, is not the property of the Hindus, but it's a name given by the Persians, and it's a Muslim name. The Hindus don't even have a name for themselves, and he has to say, no, but we do have our own name and all the rest. And this is what he says. So again, his problem is not that Hindus and Muslims are so separate that they can never get on, but they are too close together that even our name comes from someone else, belongs to someone else, all right? And this is what he says. His references to Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. We hope that the fair maid of Verona, Juliet, who made the impassioned appeal to her lover to change a name that was nor hand, nor foot, nor arm, nor face, nor any other part belonging to a man, would forgive us for this our idolatrous attachment to it, when we make bold to assert that Hindus we are and love to remain so. Further on he writes, Would the fair apostle, again Juliet, would the fair apostle of the creed that so movingly questioned what's in a name have liked it herself to nickname the god of her idolatry as Paris instead of Romeo? You know I'm sure you remember the situation, right? These are two opposing families, the Montagues and the Capulets. She happens to have fallen in love with a man from the opposing family, and therefore the name becomes a huge problem, and Paris is the rival of Romeo, right? Or would he have been ready to swear by the moon that tipped with silver all the fruit tree tops, that it would serve as sweet and musical to his heart to call his Juliet by any other name, such as, for example, Rosalind, right? So now think about the oddity of this description. This is the arch text of, if you will, modern Hindu nationalism, right? Principles of Hindutva. What is he saying? He's saying that the relationship between Hindus and Muslims is like that between the Montagues and the Capulets. It's a love story. It's a tragic love story, right? It's about intimacy. It's about the problem and violence of intimacy, and we know how Romeo and Juliet ends, all right? So his problem is also, like Jinnah, the problem of the violent intimacies between Hindus and Muslims. Hindus cannot even own their own name without Muslims constantly coming into the picture. So they have to be disentangled and separated, right, in order to become proper interests, if you will. So later on in the book, he switches from Romeo and Juliet to Coriolanus, another play of Shakespeare's. Though he doesn't mention Coriolanus, I think that's what he's referring to. And Coriolanus is a play about a Roman general who is spurned by the Roman Senate and who eventually turns traitor and goes to join the enemy of Rome, Aufidius, right, whom he has fought against for years. And there's this famous scene in the play where he comes to see Aufidius, and the two recognize each other by the wounds that each has given the other, right? So they lovingly, and it's I won't read the Shakespeare, but I mean, it's really an erotic scene, where sort of loving, they feel each other's bodies, and I wounded you there, and etc. Right? And they deal with their battles as an erotic battle, right? So I will read what I think of as Savarkar's indirect reference to Coriolanus. And here he is talking about how even in the innermost recesses of Hindu life, that even the words that Hindus use for their religious practices and sites have often come from Persian or Arabic, right? So it's a big problem because the Muslim is already inside, right? And he says, the words Darbar, Diwan Bahadur have crept like thieves to the very hearts of our Harim Mandirs, our temples. They are the scars of our old wounds. The wounds are healed, but the scars persist and seem to be incorporated with our form. As long as any attempts to scratch them out threaten to harm us more than profit, all that we can do is to tolerate them. For after all, they are the scars of the wounds received in a conflict that we have won in a gory field in which we remained as the victors of the day. So again, curious, right? Okay, we have all these Muslim terms, but we can't really remove them at the moment because they would do us more harm. So we should retain them. These are the glorious wounds we have received in a battle with those people, with the Muslims. So you notice that even with the few quotations I read, it becomes clear that the problem of communalism or Hindu-Muslim relations for these figures, these are important figures, is precisely not one of alienation and foreignness and difference and separation. It is the opposite. They are too close together, they're too intimate. So intimate that you can describe their enmity in erotic ways, in terms of Romeo and Juliet and all the rest. The problem is, how do you disentangle these groups whose violence is about intimacy and make them into interests? So Jinnah wants to make brothers who are fighting into friends. Now, brothers who are fighting, of course, that is the archetypical description of civil war. And civil war is so brutal precisely because you're fighting your own. You're fighting your own kind. If you're fighting some external enemy, you can have all kinds of rules and regulations, but you can't in a civil war. And many of these people, not least Gandhi, to whom I'm coming, describe Hindu-Muslim conflict as a civil war by the 1930s and 40s. That is a deliberate statement, because when you say civil war, you mean that, if you will, people within the same family are fighting. This is not the enmity of strangers or of conquerors or anything like that. So what I've said so far is that I've tried to describe how Ambedkar lays out the problem and then shown or tried to show how figures like Jinnah and his rival / ally, because they were allies off and on against the Indian National Congress, Savarkar, seemed to want to recover interests out of the intimate violence of Hindu-Muslim relations. Gandhi wants the opposite. Right? So now Gandhi here, in a chapter of his 1909 book, his first book, Hind Swaraj, Indian Self-Rule or Home Rule, he has a chapter in there called Why Was India Lost? And in that chapter, he attributes colonialism to interest, to the mutual interests of the British and Indians in commerce. Right? He says, India wasn't lost by force of arms. How could such few British people conquer us? It's impossible. They are here because we want them here. We keep them here. They serve our interests. And they are also themselves here, not because they're great conquerors, but because they wish to further their commercial interests. And he quotes Napoleon, the English are a nation of shopkeepers and all the rest. So he's basically deliberately reducing the glorious political, military history of colonialism to a commercial phenomenon, to an interaction of interests. Right? So interests are already bad because interests are what made the colonial rule possible. And he says, some Englishmen state that they took and they hold India by the sword. Both these statements are wrong. The sword is entirely useless for holding India. Then it follows that we keep the English in India for our base self-interest. We like their commerce. They please us by their subtle methods and get what they want from us. So interest, as I said, for him is not political so much as economic, and it results not in resistance, but acquiescence. So for colonialism to be defeated, you have to get rid of interest. You see, he's such a strange thinker. For him, what everyone else is saying is, like Savarkar or Jinnah, we need to form ourselves into interests, into political interests, so we can fight each other or get rid of the British or whatever. Gandhi is saying the opposite. Hang on, interests? Interests are what got us into this mess in the first place. The British are here because of interest, and we keep them because of our interest in their commerce, etc. Interest makes colonialism. It cannot fight it. In order to fight colonialism, you must get rid of interest. And this is where, of course, nonviolence, etc., comes in. Now, for him, for Gandhi, it is neither possible nor desirable to found Indian social relations on interest, precisely because, like the others, he thinks property was not the basis of Indian society. As long as property is not the basis of social relations, where all social relations are mediated by property, you cannot have interest as a defining category. It is only with the establishment of the colonial state as a neutral or third party that interests are as if are artificially created. Right? So Gandhi has a critique of the state as a third party. Now notice the colonial state couldn't legitimize itself in any other fashion. Right? Its legitimacy is premised upon the assertion that, look, Hindus and Muslims, for instance, are constantly at odds with each other. So India would be in a state of anarchy if we weren't here to keep the peace. So we are the third party. We are neutral. Our very foreignness makes us necessary. Right? So you can both appeal to us, Hindus and Muslims, and we will decide impartially. This is one of the planks of the legitimacy of colonial rule. And Gandhi attacks it. Right? And he says, insofar as we can think of Indians as part of interests, it is through this British state, which claims to hold the neutral, the third point, and allows for contractual relations, right? And he calls this divide and rule. This is just divide and rule. The interests that are produced through it are false interests, right? So how are interests produced? The British saying, okay, you have separate electorates. We'll produce you as an interest. We'll give you this and we'll give you guys that. But this is not the kind of interest that comes out of, as it were, the ubiquity of property that defines social relations. Right? So Gandhi thinks it's false. He thinks it's impossible to achieve a politics of interest in India, and nor would it be desirable either. Right? In Hind Swaraj, he has all these wonderfully what appear to be kooky criticisms of the figure of the third party. So, for instance, he says, doctors and lawyers are evil. All right, what do doctors do? They actually interfere between you and your own body. And so he says, you overeat, you have indigestion. You go to the doctor, you get a pill, and your indigestion, poof, it vanishes. But instead of allowing you to control your own body and therefore be master of yourself, what does this do? This makes you a slave to medicine, right? So you will continue to indulge yourself and you will just rely on the pills. The doctor and colonial medicine becomes absolutely necessary for what you think of as your well-being. But as this happens, you lose all agency. You lose all control over yourself. If you lose agency over your body, you lose agency over your politics and everything else as well. Lawyers, too, he thinks, are doing divide and rule and playing one side off against the other. So these are both colonial institutions, right? The hospital and the court of law, and they're regulated by the colonial state. So these are the sites at which these forms of interest are created, and Gandhi is very critical of them because not only are they false, but they actually prevent they make you lose control of yourself. They don't actually allow you to control yourself. You must withdraw from these institutions in order to take possession of yourself. Right? So he thinks then that, in fact, a lot of Indian social relations are characterized by what he calls idealism or disinterest. Right? He sees, look, in everyday life, it is clear that parents sacrifice for children, children sacrifice for parents, lovers sacrifice for each other. They sacrifice everywhere. But this world of social relations cannot be taken into account by our political language, which is based on interest. We can only see it as an exception or consign it to private life. For Gandhi, this is a travesty. This is absurd. Right? He thinks sacrifice is as important in defining social relations and not simply in private life as interest. Indeed, perhaps even more so, because every great social movement or political movement requires sacrifice. It requires the sacrifice often of your own life. And insofar as that happens, you automatically you put a limit to interest. Because the most basic interest is your self-interest, your life. If you're willing to sacrifice that, then the edifice of interest starts to totter. Right? So he latches onto sacrifice, and he sees it as an everyday, ubiquitous form. And he thinks you can actually build it into something that contests the interest politics of bourgeois society and of the colonial state in particular, which has been unable or unwilling to instantiate a bourgeois society in India. And I'll give you one example or two examples of how he does this. So one is during the famous Khilafat movement, immediately following the First World War. So as you know, the Ottoman Empire was defeated in the First World War, and Indian Muslims were agitated by this defeat and wanted the protection of the Caliphate and of the Sultan, the Turkish Sultan's Middle Eastern territories. Gandhi joins them, and he does so for a very interesting reason. Not only does he join them, he is made by all these Muslim clerics and others into the leader of the Khilafat movement. So here you have the most important struggle in the world for the Caliphate comes out of India and is led by a Hindu. Right? It's a remarkable irony. And Gandhi thinks that you can have a completely instrumental interest defined reading of this, right? And this is what historians have done. Gandhi wants the Muslims on board, and therefore he does a contractual deal with them, and etc. But his own words belie this. He thinks Khilafat is important because it seems to be disinterested. What are Indian Muslims getting out of this? Like, what interest could possibly be served? They don't want to go and become subjects of the Ottoman Empire. They are remaining British subjects. They petition the King Emperor, all right? So what material interest is served by the Khilafat movement? He thinks the Khilafat movement, therefore, is an ideal. It's a disinterested action, or can be. And this is what is crucial about it, right? So he says, here is recommending Hindu friendship with, Hindus must support Muslims in their struggle for the Caliphate. And precisely because the caliphate represents an ideal, it allows political mobilization that does not require interest. All right? So he says, the test of friendship is assistance in adversity, and that too unconditional assistance. Cooperation that needs consideration is a commercial contract and not friendship. Conditional cooperation is like adulterated cement which does not bind. It is the duty of Hindus, if they see the justice of the Mohammedan cause, to render cooperation. If the Mohammedans feel themselves bound in honor to spare the Hindus' feelings and stop cow killing, they may do so, no matter whether the Hindus cooperate with them or no. Though therefore I yield to no Hindu in my worship of the cow, I do not want to make the stopping of cow killing a condition precedent to cooperation. Unconditional cooperation means the protection of a cow. So here is referring to, so you have other Hindu leaders saying, okay, we'll make common cause with Muslims, but it has to be a deal. They should say they won't slaughter any cows. And if they promise to stop cow slaughter, then we will support the Caliphate. And Gandhi says, no, this is not a contract, this is not about interest, this is not a deal. We have to support the Khilafat because of its righteousness, because it is disinterested, it's an ideal, therefore it will idealize our politics as well. All right? So if the Muslims decide to stop cow slaughter, that's fine, we'll be happy. But it should not be part of a contract. A contract is like, as he puts it, adulterated cement, it does not bind. The only thing that makes a nation, it's not contract that makes nationality, it's sacrifice. All right? It's a contract is a temporary measure. Once the conditions have disappeared, the contract loses force. All right? Now, I'll give you another example and then move on quite quickly about how Gandhi thinks about interest systematically. It's not only with regard to Hindus and Muslims. So gender. Here is, there's an exchange with Rehana Tayyabji, who is a devotee of Gandhi's, in Young India in 1929. It's a debate over women's inheritance and women's rights. And she's talking about the Sarda Bill. So she writes to Gandhi and says, why should women have either to beg or to fight in order to win back their birthright? It is strange and also tragically comic to hear a man born of woman, talk loftily of the weaker sex and nobly promising to give us our due. What is this nonsense about giving? Where is the nobility and chivalry in restoring to people that which has been unlawfully wrested from them by those having brute power in their hands? So a good feminist statement, right? What do you want to give us something? Men have taken this stuff away from us. We deserve it. We want equal treatment in terms of inheritance laws. And Gandhi's response is ambiguous as always. He says, but I am uncompromising in the matter of women's rights. In my opinion, she should labor under no legal disability not suffered by man. But to remove legal inequalities will be a mere palliative. The root of the evil lies much deeper than most people realize. Man has always desired power. Ownership of property gives this power. Man hankers also after posthumous fame based on power. This cannot be had if property is progressively cut up in pieces, as it must be if all the posterity become equal co-sharers, i.e. if women also inherit equally. Hence the descent of property for the most part on the eldest male issue. You preserve the family property. Most women are married and they are co-sharers in spite of the law being against them in their husband's power and privileges. So he's saying, women also actually share in this. Right? Whilst, therefore, I would always advocate the repeal of all legal disqualifications, I should have the enlightened women of India to deal with the root cause. Woman is the embodiment of sacrifice and suffering. He loves sacrifice and suffering, as you no doubt realize by now. And her advent to public life should therefore result in purifying it, in restraining unbridled ambition and accumulation of property. Let them know that millions of men have no property to transmit to posterity. Let us learn from them that it is better for the few to have no ancestral property at all. All right, so his point is, okay, you want women to inherit and also have property. I will not be against it because obviously that would be discriminatory. But, he says, actually the root cause of the problem is not that women are not inheriting. It's that property, which is meant to produce interest, is evil, right? And millions of people, including millions of men, don't have any at all. without property only, or by severely limiting its inroads into society, will you be able to have a politics of the ideal, he thinks. Right? So Gandhi's thinking about interest and the ideal or disinterest in all kinds of ways, and rather problematically as here, right? Or ambivalently. So finally I come to Iqbal, who like Gandhi thinks interest is a bad thing and would rather not have it at all. So he also, and he's the great philosopher of modern Islam. Right? So he thinks that in India, a society based on interest was neither possible nor desirable, like Gandhi. So in his presidential address of 1932 to the All India Muslim Conference, he says, and he's talking about Hindu-Muslim conflict, the present struggle in India is sometimes described as India's revolt against the West. I do not think it is a revolt against the West, for the people of India are demanding the very institutions which the West stands for. Whether the gamble of elections, retinues of party leaders, and hollow pageants of parliaments will suit a country of peasants for whom the money economy of modern democracy is absolutely incomprehensible is a different question altogether. Educated urban India demands democracy. So basically he's saying, look, democracy is based upon what he calls the money economy of modern capitalism, and therefore property which can be exchanged, sold off, and bought at will. Right? And this is what characterizes it. But Indian society is not defined, if only because of her poverty. It's not defined by this way of thinking. It is educated urban India that demands democracy, and they will have it. But what will result from it will be, if you will, a travesty. Right? So you recall, he talks about the gamble of elections, retinues of party leaders, and hollow pageants of parliaments for a country of peasants. What then does he advise? He says he thinks that representation, both democratic, so you're represented by casting your vote, but also epistemological, where you represent something or someone, makes for reified identities and false interests. All right? So the fact that you say these are Muslims and these are their interests, it sounds reasonable, but in fact it's meaningless, or rather it is sinister, because it makes for a kind of half-baked political identity that can only result in violence. What he then seems to want to do is to actually, if you will, invisibilize, in particular, Hindu and Muslim identities. Right? It's very interesting. So he goes on to say in the speech, in view of the visible and invisible points of contact between the various communities of India, I do believe in the possibility of constructing a harmonious whole whose unity cannot be disturbed by the rich diversity which it must carry within its bosom. The problem of ancient Indian thought was how the one became many without sacrificing its oneness. Today, this problem has come down from its ethical heights to the grosser plane of our political life, and we have to solve it in its reversed form. That is, how the many can become one without sacrificing its plural character. So that is a direct reference from Hegel, from the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, this reversal, right? How you begin with what you begin with and what you end with. But this phrase, visible and invisible points of contact, is what I want to focus on here. Gandhi also uses invisible points of contact. What are invisible points of contact? So in view of the visible and invisible points of contact between the various communities of India. So like Gandhi, in some sense, though Gandhi wants to make these relations visible by saying, for instance, that, look, sacrifice is what really makes social relations in India. We all sacrifice for each other. And how do you actually promote this way of making relations and transform it into a politics? Iqbal is a far more esoteric thinker, in a way. For him, Hindus and Muslims, for instance, but any other groups or people, are capable of have a number of existential relations which cannot be named, which cannot be named and represented and therefore become some version of interest. And what you must do is to reflect upon these, what he calls invisible points of contact. And I'll end very quickly by suggesting that he himself does this in his poetry. If you look at Iqbal's poetry, it's very interesting. So there are poems in which you have a very clear Hindu or Sikh elements. There's a poem called Nanak, there's a poem called Ram, right? So they appear to be naming communities. But when you look at them more closely, something odd is happening. The poem on Rama, the deity, is written in such a way that if it didn't have the title Rama, you wouldn't actually know. It's in highly Persianized Urdu. There's not a single Hindi/Sanskrit word, even though there are many such words that you could use in Urdu, right? And he calls Rama Imam-e-Hind. He gives him an explicitly Islamic coloration. This poem was read out from the Red Fort by former Prime Minister Vajpayee, by the way. And you have a poem like Khurshid, the sun, which is, you read it and it's highly Persianized Urdu, but there's a parenthesis and he says, this is a translation of the Gayatri Mantra, so an important Hindu. If you didn't know, if he didn't tell you, you wouldn't know. So in a way, what he's doing is invisibilizing the Hindu by internalizing. You can see how the things that worry Savarkar in that whole thing about Romeo and Juliet and our name, and in a way, for Iqbal, those are good things, right? How do you appropriate, internalize, and allow to illumine you from within what appears to be other? Right? But you cannot name it, you cannot represent it. It's only through these literary genres that he rehearses what I'm calling these invisible points of contact. So there are other examples I could give, but I will stop here and to summarize only say that the four figures I've dealt with, Ambedkar lays out the problem, Savarkar and Jinnah see the problem but are invested in turning communities into interest groups and therefore disallowing their political manifestation in a way. Savarkar also is not interested in religion after all, right? And on the other side you have Gandhi and Iqbal, for whom interests are, they don't want interests, they think they're impossible and undesirable. And so you have to move to another way of thinking about politics. For Gandhi, it's idealism and disinterest. And for Iqbal, it ends up being these sort of invisible points of contact. So thank you.